History holes.
How does a nation find its soul? For 1,000 years, it was buried under the weight of an empire. For a generation after, it was fractured, torn apart by warlords fighting over the scraps. In our last episode, we saw how the first independent dynasties struggled to unify the land from a capital carved out of stone mountains, a fortress built for survival, a capital of a people who were still looking over their shoulder. But a nation cannot survive forever in a fortress. To truly prosper, to create a golden age, it must have the confidence to step out into the open, to build its future on the fertile soil of its heartland. It needed a new vision, a new capital, and a new kind of leader. Not a warrior king born of a powerful clan, but an orphan raised by monks who understood that true power came not just from the sword, but from the spirit of the people. This is the story of the Lý Dynasty. It is the story of how one man's prophecy gave birth to the city of Hanoi, and how that city, Thăng Long, the city of the soaring dragon, became the heart of Vietnam's first great golden age, an era of art, law, literature, and legendary defiance that would define what it meant to be Vietnamese for 1,000 years to come. Part 1. The year is 1009. The dragon throne of the Vietnamese people is occupied, but the ruler does not sit upon it. He lies. This is Lê Long Dinh, a name history would twist into Ngoại Trio, the lying down emperor. His court is not a place of governance, but a theater of cruelty. Prisoners are roasted alive in cages, forced to climb trees only to be felled with the trunk, or drowned in rivers while he laughs. This was the grim state of the kingdom, a nation barely a century into its independence, already exhausted by chaos, now led by a debauched tyrant. But in the shadows of this corrupt court, another man watched. He was not a prince. He was not from a great clan. He was a temple orphan, a man of quiet contemplation and proven loyalty who commanded the palace guard. His name was Công Uẩn, and while the lying-down emperor indulged his whims, the people, the monks, and the very land itself began to whisper prophecies of a different leader, of a new mandate from heaven. The vision of Công Uẩn. Uẩn story is unlike any founder we have met so far. He was a child of the temple, not the court. Given to a monastery at the age of 3, he was raised and educated by the most eminent Buddhist patriarch of the time, a man named Van Hunt. His worldview was shaped not by the intrigues of nobles, but by the discipline of the sutras and the deep connection the Buddhist faith had with the common people. Yet he was no mere scholar. He rose through the ranks to become the trusted commander of the palace guard, a position that placed him at the very center of power, forced to witness the daily decay of the dynasty he served. When Lê Long Dinh died after a reign of just 4 years, history held its breath. The transition could have been another bloodbath, another descent into civil war. Instead, it was quiet. It was decisive. The court officials, the military commanders, and the powerful Buddhist clergy all looked to one man. By what historians call general acclamation, Công Uẩn took the throne. There was no war of succession. There was only a collective sense that the nation needed a healer, a unifier. It needed a man of virtue. His first act as emperor would change the course of Vietnamese history. He declared that he was abandoning Hoa Lu. Think of what this meant. For decades, Hoa Lu had been the symbol of Vietnamese independence, a nearly impenetrable fortress nestled among limestone karsts. It was a capital built out of fear. Công Uẩn knew that to build a future, you couldn't be trapped by the fears of the past. In his own words, preserved in a royal edict, he looked to the site of the old Tang Dynasty administrative center, Dai La, noting it was situated at the center of heaven and earth. Its position is shaped like a coiled dragon and a sitting tiger. The ground is high and open. He saw not a fortress, but a hub, a place where a nation could truly grow. And then came the moment that sealed the destiny of this new era. As Công Uẩn royal barge docked at the new capital, legend tells us a golden dragon soared into the sky directly above his head. It was a sign of immense power and divine approval. The emperor renamed the city on the spot, Thăng Long, the city of the soaring dragon. This was the birth of modern-day Hanoi, a city founded not on conquest, but on a prophecy of greatness. Building the Dragon City, the new capital was built on a grand scale. Palaces, pavilions, and temples rose from the earth. But Công Uẩn, now known by his temple name Lý Thái Tô, knew a nation was more than just walls and buildings. He immediately set about healing the wounds of the previous reign. He issued a 3-year tax holiday for the entire kingdom. He ordered all villages to repair their neglected shrines and temples, restoring the spiritual heart of the communities. He was a builder in every sense of the word, but his benevolence was not weakness. When rebellions flared up in the southern provinces of Hanoi and Guyane, he led his armies in person, campaigning for 2 years to burn villages and capture defiant leaders. A famous story tells of his return journey by sea when a great storm nearly sank his fleet. He saw it as a divine judgment for the violence of his campaign, and he prayed to heaven, accepting punishment for himself, but begging forgiveness for his soldiers. The storm, it is said, immediately calmed. Here was a ruler who felt the profound weight of his actions, who saw himself as accountable not just to his court, but to the cosmos itself. This deep spirituality was woven into his statecraft. He was a devout Buddhist, and under the Li, Buddhism became the soul of the nation. He oversaw the ordination of thousands of monks and appointed officials to manage the vast lands belonging to the temples. This wasn't just patronage, it was a partnership. The throne and the temple would govern together, one tending to the body of the nation, the other to its spirit. It was from this stable foundation, a new capital, a healed populace, and a shared faith, that Vietnam's first golden age would truly begin. Part 2. A capital is only a city until a great king makes it the heart of a nation. Lý Thái Tô had laid the foundation, but it would fall to his son, Lý Phật Mát, known to history as Lý Thái Tông, to build the nation itself. He was nothing like his contemplative father. He was a man of boundless energy, as comfortable on the back of a war elephant as he was on the throne. This was the most vigorous and charismatic of all the Lý kings, a ruler who would quite literally put his own hands to the plow, a flourishing of culture and intellect. There was a famous annual ceremony where the emperor would ritually open the planting season. In the past, it was symbolic. But when his officials told Lý Thái Tông that plowing was a farmer's work, he simply replied, "If I do not plow, what rice can I use for my sacrifices to the spirits, and what kind of leadership will there be in the realm?" And with that, he took the plow and tilled the field himself. This was his style of leadership, direct, personal, and deeply connected to the land and the people. He also saw that a kingdom needed more than just rice, it needed rules. He commissioned the writing of the Hin Thu, or Book of Punishments, the first comprehensive penal code in Vietnamese history. For the first time, law was being codified and made accessible, a crucial step in creating a just and stable society. This drive to build a nation on solid principles reached its peak under his successors. In the year 1070, a structure was raised in Thăng Long that would shape the mind of Vietnam for the next 1,000 years, the Văn Miếu, or Temple of Literature. It was a shrine to Confucius and the great sages, but it was much more than that. It was to be the nation's first university. 5 years later, in 1075, the court held the first civil service examinations. This was a revolution. Suddenly, the path to power was not limited to birthright or brute force. Now a young man from a provincial village, if he had the intellect and the discipline to master the classics, could rise to the highest levels of government. A new class was born, the scholar official. And what did these scholars study? They studied the 3 teachings. But in Vietnam, these weren't rival schools of thought as they often were in China. Here they were woven together. Buddhism was the great faith of the people and the court, a path to spiritual enlightenment. Confucianism provided the ethical blueprint for an orderly society and a merit-based government. And Taoism, with its deep connection to nature and the spirit world, infused the daily rituals of Vietnamese life. This unique synthesis, this Vietnamization of ideas, created a culture that was both sophisticated and deeply rooted in its own soil. The great general and the poetic proclamation. But this flourishing culture was growing in the shadow of a giant. The Song Dynasty in China was entering a period of aggressive reform under its powerful chancellor, Wang Anshi, and many at the Song court still saw Vietnam as a renegade province that needed to be brought back into the fold. They began preparing for war. But the Vietnamese court had a secret weapon, one of the most unlikely military geniuses in history, a eunuch named Lý Thường Kiệt. Understanding that waiting for the Song to invade would be suicide, Lý Thường Kiệt planned one of the most audacious campaigns imaginable. In 1075, he launched a massive preemptive strike, a combined land and sea invasion deep into Song territory. His forces, numbering close to 100,000 men, ravaged Chinese coastal cities, destroyed supply depots, and laid siege to the great city of Nanning. He even engaged in psychological warfare, posting placards explaining he had come to save the Chinese people from Wang Anshi's unpopular tax policies. The strike crippled the Song war machine and bought Vietnam precious time to prepare its defenses. The time came in 1077. The massive Song army invaded and pushed south to the banks of the Nguyen River, just 45 kilometers from the capital. This was the final defensive line. Lý Thường Kiệt had turned the southern bank into a fortress, a massive rampart of earth and bamboo fences, defended by over 400 warboats hidden in the river. For weeks, the Song army was stalled, unable to cross. The fate of the nation hung in the balance, and it was here that Lý Thường Kiệt deployed his most powerful weapon. One night, from a temple hidden in the darkness on the riverbank, a voice boomed out as if from a god, reciting a poem for all to hear, both Vietnamese and Chinese. Later historians would attribute the poem to Lý Thường Kiệt himself. It declared, "Over the southern mountains and rivers, the southern emperor reigns. This destiny is inscribed in the book of heaven. How dare you invaders come to trespass? You will surely meet your own defeat." This was more than poetry. It was a divine proclamation, a declaration of sovereignty that electrified the Vietnamese soldiers and demoralized the enemy. It asserted that Vietnam was not a breakaway province. It was its own empire, with its own emperor, and its own mandate from heaven. In the brutal battles that followed, the Vietnamese, inspired by this divine promise, held the line. The exhausted and disease-ridden Song army was eventually forced to retreat. The Lý Dynasty had not just survived, it had cemented Vietnam's independence for the next 200 years. Part 3. After the victory against the Song, a long peace settled over Dai Viet. The reign of Lý Nhân Tông, who sat on the throne for over 50 years, marked the zenith of the dynasty. It was a time of prosperity and soaring cultural confidence. The foundations laid by his predecessors were now built upon, creating a kingdom that was stable, wealthy, and secure. But golden ages are fragile. The very stability the Lý had created contained the seeds of its own destruction. The dragon had reached the apex of its flight and was about to begin its long, tragic descent. The zenith of a golden age. For decades, the kingdom flourished. While the emperor was often a child, powerful and loyal regents like Lý Đào Thanh ensured that the state ran smoothly. The military, led by veterans like Lý Thường Kiệt until his death, continued to push the southward march against the kingdom of Champa, slowly but surely expanding the Vietnamese realm. At home, this was an era of immense cultural production. Buddhist philosophy reached new heights of sophistication, and the court was filled with the first generations of scholar officials produced by the National University. For a time, it seemed as if the Lý Dynasty had perfected the art of governance. The seeds of decay. The problem was a fatal flaw in the system. After the long reign of Lý Nhân Tông, the dynasty fell into a pattern of placing child emperors on the throne. These young boys were kings in name only. Real power shifted to the people who controlled them, their mothers, their maternal uncles, and powerful court ministers. The dynasty of the Lý was slowly being replaced by a government of courtly clans. The desperation to secure a male heir led to one of the strangest succession stories in Vietnamese history. The Emperor Lý Thường Tông, who came to the throne as a boy, was believed by many at court to be the reincarnation of a powerful Buddhist monk with magical abilities named Tu Dao Han. Think about that. The court had become so detached from the line of powerful kings that they sought legitimacy in the world of spirits and reincarnation. The charismatic authority of the early emperors was gone, replaced by superstition and intrigue. Into this power vacuum stepped ambitious and ruthless men. The most powerful of these was Doang Vu. For 2 decades in the mid-12th century, he was the absolute master of the court. He was the Queen Mother's lover, the commander of the armies, and the man who made or broke careers. The emperor was merely a symbol he used to legitimize his rule. The court became a nest of conspiracies as rival families fought for influence. For a brief time, a principled official named Tohyintan managed to hold the state together, but he was the exception. The Li emperors had become puppets, and their strings were being pulled by men with no loyalty to the dynasty, only to their own ambition. The collapse, the final decades of the Li were a complete collapse into anarchy. The Emperor Li Kaotong was a hopeless playboy who taxed the people into poverty to pay for his lavish lifestyle, neglecting the dikes and letting the country fall into ruin. The countryside exploded in rebellion. The court itself disintegrated into open warfare between powerful families. The capital, Tanglong, the city of the soaring dragon, became a battlefield. Out of this chaos, a new power emerged. They were not from the traditional aristocracy. They were the Trun clan, a family from the eastern coast who had built their power on the frontiers of the kingdom, commanding vast estates and loyal private armies. As the Li court tore itself apart, the Trun saw their opportunity. The final act of the Li dynasty is a tragedy. The penultimate king, Li Huitung, was a broken man, suffering from epilepsy and paranoia, a mere pawn in the games of warlords. Knowing the end was near, he was forced to do the unthinkable, to abdicate in favor of his 7-year-old daughter, Li Chiuhuang, the first and only empress in Vietnamese history. But the child empress was not meant to rule. She was the final piece in a ruthless political checkmate. The leader of the Trun clan, a man named Trun Thu Do, arranged a marriage between the little empress and his own 8-year-old nephew. Then, in the year 1225, he forced her to abdicate, formally transferring the mandate of heaven to her child husband, and thus to the Trun clan. The Li dynasty, the dynasty of the soaring dragon, was over. Part 4. And so, the story that began with the prophetic vision of a soaring dragon ends with the quiet, forced abdication of a child empress. For 216 years, the Li dynasty guided Dai Viet. They inherited a fractured land of warlords and left behind a unified kingdom. They took a people defined by a millennium of resistance and gave them a vibrant, self-assured culture. They established institutions, a stable capital, a national university, a system of law, so strong that they would outlast the dynasty itself. This was, in so many ways, Vietnam's first true golden age. It was an era of profound confidence, a time when the Vietnamese looked inward and forged an identity that was uniquely their own, blending the teachings of their neighbors with their own native spirit. They proved on the battlefield that their independence was not a historical accident, but a right they would defend with both brilliance and blood. The Li dynasty set the standard for what an independent Vietnamese nation could be. But their fatal flaw was a reliance on the strength of a single bloodline. When that line weakened, when the court became a playground for powerful clans more loyal to their own ambitions than to the throne, the entire structure began to crumble. The dynasty fell not to a foreign invader, but to the slow decay from within. Yet in its collapse, it paved the way for a new power, one born not in the halls of the monastery, but on the rugged coasts of the sea. A dynasty of hardened warriors who would take the foundations laid by the Li and build an empire strong enough to defy the world's greatest conqueror. I thank you very much for joining us on this journey. Please leave a like and subscribe if you want more. If you feel like it, tell us what else you'd like to hear. See you on the next episode.